So yeah, I don't see any reason why I would put this off any longer. All right. So today we're going to be doing Jay Foreman's Unfinished London series, which I'm super excited about. I really enjoy Map Men. I always find like the British style of humor to be endlessly charming. It's always been something that's kind of got me. Hold on. I'm sorry for all the interruptions. He's having a bad day, you know. He's having a bad day, and we gotta love our homies even when they're having a bad day. There you go. All right, now I'm actually back. Okay. All right, so today we're gonna be doing Unfinished London, which is a Jay Foreman series. He's the guy who does Map Men. Like I said, I find the British sense of humor to be endlessly charming, and they kind of exemplify a lot of classic British humor that I've enjoyed growing up and to this day. It's really absolutely lovely, so I'm totally down with checking out some more from him. And I was told that the Unfinished London series was really cool. So we're going to be doing episodes 1 through 3. The first one we have is the Unfinished Northern Line. So this is like modern British geographical problems, I suppose. Like this is, it's probably going to be grounded in a little bit of history by which would explain why things are the way they are. But this is modern geographic problems, I suppose. The Unfinished Northern Line, I don't know what any of this stuff means. They always reference stuff related to different places in England, and I don't know the significance of a lot of it. They reference a certain group of people like disparagingly, and I'm like, do they have beef with that group of people? Is this serious? Or is this like a joke that I could only understand if I were there? It's that sort of thing. So here we go.
Edgware in northwest London used to look like that, but thanks to these, it now looks like this. And a few miles away, Bushy Heath was supposed to look like that, but because of him, it looks like this. That, these, this, that, him, what, this.
That's very complicated.
Story of a town planning cock-up that happened 50 years ago. One of many examples of unfinished London.
So we know that this ties back to World War II.
A rather pointless Mill Hill East tube station. It sits on its own at the end of a branch poking awkwardly out of the Northern Line, and it's only wide enough for one train at a time, making the tube more complicated for everybody. You might wonder, why would they put a station in such an awkward and confusing place? The answer is, they didn't do it on purpose, and the clues as to why it's ended up like it has can be seen from up there. If you look on Google Earth, you can see the Northern Line snaking through London between the houses up here to Mill Hill East. But if you look carefully, you can see that the thin snaking line doesn't stop there. It keeps going through this row of trees, under the M1, and between these houses in a dead straight line. Just from looking, you can tell that there used to be a train line here.
Oh.
So what was this train line, and why isn't it a train line anymore? It was a branch of the Great Northern Railway built in 1867 that went from King's Cross to Edgware, as in the original Edgware station, which has since been demolished and turned into the Broadwalk Shopping Centre. Some of this old-fashioned steam line became today's Northern Line, but the bit between Edgware and Mill Hill closed in 1964, under the orders of the infamous Dr. Beeching, chairman of British Rail with an incurable phobia of trains. This station survived the accident.
I don't know what the beef was with trains at the time. In the United States, we've always been pretty fond of the idea of trains, even though we've kind of moved away from that sort of thing. I don't know as much how much trains affect like our shipping and all that, but as far as like trains for like transporting people, we don't have as much as we probably should, considering our massive size and how much we leaned on them for so long. We've moved so much against trains in favor of the car, and we've totally forsaken any sort of sensible forms of public transportation. Our roads are just not built for it.
because the line was electrified as far as here in 1939. And today, this tiny branch to Mill Hill East is all that's left. The rest of the line is now a bridge over nothing, this footpath no one ever uses, another bridge over nothing, and this nature reserve I'm currently trespassing on. But the interesting thing about this line is there would most probably still be trains on it right now if it weren't for a big screw-up that happened 20 years before the line closed. In the 30s, there were plans to extend the Northern Line from Mill Hill East over the old steam railway to Edgware, where it would have met the other end of the Northern Line. Then, after that, they were going to build 3 new stations called Brockley Hill, Elstree South and Bushey Heath. This project was called the Northern Heights Plan, and on the tube map it would have looked like this. The architects from back then have left clues all over the place that they were really serious about building this extension. Clue number 1. Today in Edgware, the trains terminate here, but the tunnel, seemingly for no reason at all, keeps going. Clue number 2.
Oh.
On Google Earth, we can see exactly where the line would have gone. There's a trail of dead-end streets and modern houses that don't quite fit in with their 1930s surroundings. That's because a gap was left on purpose for the line to go, but decades later, when the railway never came, they squeezed in these buildings instead. This one's got a swimming pool. The imaginary line would have come...
Despite my laughter, I was expecting it to be more jokey considering what I've seen in the Mapman stuff, but this is actually very information dense compared to like the other stuff. Like the other stuff's information dense too because of the pacing. I find a lot of British humor is very fast, and like you see that very much in the Mapmen series, but here he's really packing in information, and like there's a few jokes here and there, but it's not like my main focus. I'm actually quite fascinated and more with what he's talking about than what his next joke is going to be, which it might be the other way around with the Madman stuff. Like, I'm so infatuated with British humor that I'm just waiting for the next joke more than I'm waiting for the next bit of information, though it's good in both facets.
Here, over the road, on a bridge that they started building, then the line carries on down there to the best clue of all. Clue number 4, the car boot sale behind the roundabout at Cannon's Corner. This was supposed to become Brockley Hill Station. Here's an artist's impression of what Brockley Hill Station would have looked like. Just like the stations we know and love today, it was designed in Art Deco style with a ticket hall, shopping parade, and that bus stop which is still there today as a now useless lay-by on the A41. The platforms were to be suspended high up on 7 brick arches. They started building the arches, but that's as far as they got. And today, all that's left of the station is these stumpy brick things.
Oh.
Ghostly, aren't they? As the imaginary line goes further and further north, the clues start to run out. The next station would have been Elstree South, which is now a petrol station. Pretty much no evidence here at all, but apparently there's 500 metres of tunnel underneath here. And after that, Bushey Heath, which is now a nothing. So they started, but why didn't they finish the extension? The simple answer is that the war came along,
there you go.
put an end to all funding for the project. And by the time the war was over, they'd changed their mind. New legislation called Greenbelt had come in after the war to preserve the countryside and prevent towns from merging into big mutant conurbations. A massive splodge of Greenbelt was put right where the extension was going to go, which meant no one was allowed to build houses. No new houses, no need for new stations, and the Northern Heights Plan was officially abandoned forever on the 9th of February 1954. So what? They were going to build a train line, but then they didn't. Who cares? I do, and I'll show you why it matters. In the olden days, a train station coming to the...
Yeah, I don't know how much I don't know too much about British reliance on trains in the modern day, so this is familiarizing myself with British geographic problems is going to make this a lot more clear to me. Maybe if you already are there, you may understand why this is a problem, but I don't. I just assumed that you guys were flooded with trains.
The area was big news. In the ambitious interwar years, wherever trains appeared, swathes of suburban housing would follow. Posters like these, depicting rolling countryside, got people to migrate here in their thousands. And as you can imagine, it had an enormous effect on the area, transforming rural Middlesex into suburban London. Just look what happened to Edgware. This is a map of the area in 1924.
In England, there was a big push in the late 20th century to privatize the rail industry. Okay, yeah. They also split the rail operators and the train operators into different companies. Okay. I can understand that much. London relies very much on local train service, especially for commuting. Dude, I wish we had decent access to that here. That would be so much better. I wish I didn't have to drive. I don't even like having a car.
After they finished building the new tube station. Within 10 years, the rural countryside was transformed from this into this. Ah!
That's like Ford's fault, I believe, right? Like that's Henry Ford's fault. I don't know too much about it, but I was told that like as like cars started to develop and become more common in the United States, like they started building the United States around the vehicle, around the personal vehicle rather than the public transportation, which made people dependent upon the personal vehicle. That's my understanding and how I interpret what was explained to me. If I get that wrong, I apologize.
And the same thing was happening all over Middlesex, in Rayners Lane, and in Kingsbury. Oh. Ironically, the fields in this poster have all gone as a direct result of the very poster that depicted them. Idiots. So that's why pretty much all houses in suburbia look the same. They were all built more or less in one go. And I find that fascinating because it was done on the kind of scale that we simply wouldn't dream of these days. Actually imagine what it must have been like for the people that were already living here. That's why it matters that they didn't finish the Northern Heights. It would have meant that from Edgware stretching all the way up to Bushy Heath, there would have been a horizonless sprawl of semi-detached, semi-identical houses. Before the railway, Edgware used to look like this, and had the Northern Heights been finished, where I'm standing now would look like Edgware. That's what the Greenbelt was trying to put a stop to. And by the way, aren't we lucky the architects of the 30s had taste? Imagine if suburbia, as in a third of all homes in London, had been built by the architects of the 60s. I think the biggest transformation...
Like, I get the purpose of that. Like, that does not look good, but, hold on. Wait.
Had been built by the
architects of the 60s. Like, that is not pretty, but there is, I guess, I suppose it's like leaning into efficiency. A lot of that is what you see in Eastern Europe, where it really leans more into efficiency than frills and stuff, and that's just something that I've found is very common in that culture. In that like broad culture over there.
I think the biggest transformation...
I get the purpose.
Right here, at this roundabout on the A41. Doesn't look like much, but if I just zoom out here, turn it around a little bit, ignore the M1, that wasn't built to the 60s. There. This is where the extension was going to end, Bushy Heath Station, and there was going to be a whole new shopping parade to go with it. The roundabout would have been surrounded by shops, pubs, restaurants, and a cinema. It's pretty hard to imagine standing here what it all would have looked like. So, here's a visual aid. This is Queensbury, 4 miles to the south. In 1932, this was a big empty field, just like Bushy Heath. But by 1934, it had this station and all of these shops. So the roundabout in Bushy Heath probably would have looked a lot like this.
I have something I find interesting. I don't know if any of you will find it interesting, but I find it interesting. We call it a roundabout as well, like the little circles where you drive through and you get off on one of a few different exits. Those little circles. But they're called many different things. They're called roundabouts, traffic circles, rotaries. They're called many different things, and it often changes. It's dependent on where you are from in a lot of ways. In some places, they're interchangeable. Where I'm from, the region of the United States I'm from is called New England, and we call it a roundabout as well, which I find really interesting because it shows something that I've always suspected for like the longest time, that in some ways we in the Northeast United States have more in common with English people than we do with some people in other parts of the United States, which I find incredibly interesting. It just depends on what you're talking about. In some ways, I might relate more to a Texan than an Englishman, but in some ways, it might be the other way around, depending on. And this is just like a small thing, but that's something that I've always had my eye out for. Like, where does England and New England overlap? And there's always been such a vague connection, but it's always there.
I admit it, I'm being nostalgic for a railway I'm too young to remember and some stations that never existed. But here's a thought. Are we Londoners any worse off today because they never finished the Northern Heights? After all, even with the Green Belt, there are still plenty of people living in Bushey and Elstree that might use the line. Like me, for example. There are so many journeys that I have to make that would be much easier by tube, especially the bit between Edgware and Mill Hill East. Will they ever rebuild the old railway, reconnecting the two branches of the Northern Line? The answer is no. The old Mill Hill Railway will definitely never be rebuilt because we've burnt our bridges and built gubbins in the way, like this, this, and this, which is actually my grandma's house. To rebuild the line, we'd have to knock it down.
You don't. Well, you can't do that.
Down, do you?
No.
Should we have safeguarded the route in case we changed our minds? I think allowing development.
It's one of those things where it's like it's too late. Like it would be completely unethical to displace those people. Like here, when we have something that we want to build and people are in the way, sometimes private interests who have a vested interest in whatever construction project would try to buy out the homes that are in the way. That is one route that one could go for, but very rarely can you buy out every single one. Somebody might hold out. I believe the airport in my state, we only have one, I believe that they've been waiting for this one lady to die for like the longest time so that they could build an extension to the airport, and she's just been holding out this whole time. They'd probably be willing to throw buckets of cash her way, but she's like, nope, I'm holding out. You're just gonna have to wait till I die to build the airport. So it's not as simple as even buying out the locations. Like at this point, it's probably too little, too late.
On the line was short-sighted, and they should never have built this stupid house. But what about those stations beyond Edgware? Is it such a bad thing they were never built? I think probably not. First of all, this
Neron, we call it roundabouts too, but in the north part of the country, they mostly in older generations, they call them road circles. That's a new one to me. I'm not surprised. Like, you're from Sri Lanka, correct? And there is kind of an imperial British presence in the region. So I'm actually not surprised by that at all, that would be a thing. Oh, thank you, Light Giver, for the $4.99. I really appreciate it. Vermont is rightful Empire City Clay and is simply just a rebellious county. I don't think of Vermont as rebellious, but maybe there's a rebellious spirit that I'm not quite appreciating enough. I don't know. Perhaps.
Greenbelt is lovely. Green, tranquil countryside with wildlife and nature.
You know what? Vermont is like rebellious in a way. Sorry, I hate to do the start and stop thing. They're very liberal. They're one of the more like liberal places in the country, to a more conservative American sensibility. Maybe they do feel rebellious. I'm of course, I'm a Northeasterner as well. I'm basically a commie because of that. I joke, but maybe Vermont doesn't look too crazy to me because I live in a relatively liberal place. So, I don't know. That's an interesting thought.
Greenbelt is lovely. Green, tranquil countryside with wildlife and nature and trees, breathing lovely fluffy oxygen into our precious atmosphere. Second of all, I think London had already done quite enough expanding already. The planners of the 1930s, bless their cotton socks, never imagined that those front gardens they lovingly designed for us would nearly all turn into driveways, or that a typical family could have more than 2 cars. They couldn't possibly have known the damage they were doing for air pollution and traffic congestion. And if they came out this far, who knows when or where they might have stopped. And
he's just at some guy's house.
Houses here, there'd have been no room for the very, very important M1. And where would we be without that? So you could say the war came just in time, putting a stop to London's wild expansion. For now. I love London's imperfections, and I think there's something mad and exciting about the clues to a whole new dimension, the London that could have been. A truly great city like London gets its character not from how it successfully planned for the future, but how it failed. And obviously, the failed plans of the Northern Heights is just one of London's many failed plans. Only one chapter in the big and ongoing story of unfinished London.
Dude, this is fascinating. Like, this is something that I've always wanted to do, because it's like, naturally my conversation has gone through, like, how can I relate to London and how people there live their lives. That's kind of how I've always, like, tried to view it, because I like seeing what we have in common. Naturally, New England came from England. We would have a lot in common. And I kind of like to know where a lot of the culture that in the United States developed somewhat independently, but somewhat dependently. It's kind of like this weird sort of balance between the two, where we have our own unique identity, but we can never fully escape what we are, where we came from. Even in events that happened far after independence, decisions that people make they can in a lot of ways be influenced by that. We're sometimes products of our environment, sometimes products of, well, we're most often products of environment. This is the main thing there. That guy's like, what are you doing in my house? I think that's the vibe that he wanted us to get. Vermont was originally claimed by both Massachusetts and New York. The land was given to New York by the Crown, but Massachusetts sent settlers there anyway. That seems like something Massachusetts would do. Like I said at the beginning of the stream, Rhode Island being another kind of smaller place, Connecticut and Massachusetts basically tried to eat us on both sides, which is a pretty disgusting bit of imagery if you have a very strong imagination. So yeah, there's something there. I feel like maybe Rhode Island and Vermont need to hang out. You know, I feel like we have a lot in common. Which state claimed Maine before it got split off? That was Massachusetts as well. Yeah. Massachusetts was claiming pretty much everything. I'm sorry that the MapMen stuff has branched off into discussions about New England, but it's kind of the lens through which I see things. I'm a New Englander at heart, so it's just kind of how I try to understand things. So I'm sorry if the conversation strays a little too far from the main subject, but either way, let's get to the next one. I have 3 of these lined up. We can do London's unfinished motorways. So we were going from trains, now we're going to cars, I suppose. And then after that, we've got, why does London have so many airports? There we go. Cars, trains, planes.
If you've ever tried driving around London, you'll know what a nightmare it is. We Londoners spend longer sitting in traffic jams than anyone else in the country, and most of us don't even enjoy it. In the 1960s, there were ambitious plans to completely transform London's roads, making jams like these a thing of the past. They made a start in some places, but as you can see, they didn't finish.
I've seen some interesting theories about how to decongest crowded cities. So this is something that they deal with a lot. Of course, in California, New York, or whatever, we have a lot in common with London in that sense. The population density of London, I'm pretty sure, is like incredibly high. So that sounds like a terrible challenge. I'm curious about this one.
London was not
I just noticed that the logo isn't finished. That's genius. This guy's a genius.
In fact, it wasn't designed at all. It grew in gradual steps, with the Romans, Tudors, and Victorians all contributing their own streets, many of which remain today. It's these very same streets that we in the 21st century squeeze onto, trying to get about in our cars, buses, and lorries. Look at this. The quickest way to get from, say, Hampstead to Highbury is to go all the way down to Camden Town, through the complicated one-way system, all the way back up to Holloway and down Holloway Road, which takes ages. At peak time, the average speed for that journey is a pathetic 10 miles an hour. I can run that fast! You might think, how can London go on with a road system as slow as this? Well, they were thinking about that as early as the 1940s. In 1944, a man called Patrick Abercrombie produced the County of London Plan.
Abercrombie!
Its aim? To deal with the looming problem of congestion in London. London
I know that name.
Beating in the Blitz.
Not just from the clothing brand, but I have heard that name. I don't know if it's the same guy, but sounds familiar.
So there was a great opportunity for rebuilding everything. Abercrombie saw it as a chance to give London a new road system fit for the 20th century. In central London, narrow Victorian streets would be bulldozed to make way for wide Paris-style boulevards, and for the suburbs, there'd be wide ring roads going in circles around the city. Ring roads play a crucial role in modern town planning. Here to explain is transport expert Graham Rhodes.
Ring roads allow vehicles to travel from one side of town to the other without going through the busy middle, so that's fewer traffic jams and faster journeys.
Patrick Abercrombie was really ahead of his time because the traffic wasn't so bad in the 40s. People didn't pay much attention to his rather ambitious plans until 20 years later.
So you just don't have to pass through a place. Okay. I get that. I can kind of follow where we're going on here.
By 1966, car ownership had skyrocketed. Everyone had a car, and everyone was causing traffic jams. Abercrombie was dead by now, but his bold plans were just coming to life. Not only did the rebuilding of London's roads seem like a good idea, it was now essential. The planners of the 60s liked Abercrombie's ring roads idea, but they wanted to take it quite literally to a new level. A new type of road that was futuristic-er than anything Abercrombie had ever seen, the motorway. 6 lanes, a central reservation and hard shoulder for safety, no speed limits back then. The first motorway to open in Britain was the M1, invented in 1959.
Jeepers.
1966,
Terrible.
for the first time, motorways were going to be brought right to the heart of the capital. Ugh. The plan was to build 4 motorway ring roads in and around London.
The name of the video we were watching is London's Unfinished Motorways. And if anybody's wondering, the next one is why does London have so many? And I believe the next word is airports. So there we go. We started with trains. We're doing cars now. Next, we're going to be doing planes.
And the name for the project was Ringways. Ringway 1 was to form a motorway box around central London. Ringway 2 was further out, making a circle through the middle of the suburbs. Ringway 3 was further out still, roughly following the border of Greater London. And Ringway 4, way out in the countryside, was for traffic that wanted to avoid London altogether. Today,
that is really
hardly
interesting.
Any of it has been built. The plans were vast, ambitious, disruptive, expensive, and extremely unpopular. Only one complete circle was ever made, the M25. By 1973, they'd made a good start on Ringway 3 up near Potters Bar, and at the time it was called the M16. Bits of Ringway 4 were also starting to appear. But 2 years later, the Ringway scheme was officially cancelled. So instead, it was decided to connect up the bits of 3 and 4 that they'd built so far, making one complete loop. Finally, in 1986, the M25 was opened to the public by Margaret Thatcher.
Oh, of course it was Thatcher.
You can see evidence of them hastily stitching up the 2 routes today. Up by South Mimms, the M25 famously splits into...
Question, is Thatcher still popular? I think I've asked this in the past. I don't remember what the answer was. Like, is there still like a significant number of people that like Thatcher? Because like, she's always seen as like, from the United States, she's like, oh, she's the British Ronald Reagan, which I don't know if that's oversimplified or not. It probably is. It has to be. But I don't know if people still like her. I see quotes from her all the time, though. Just like I see stuff from Ronald Reagan. America's never really let go of Reagan, but I don't believe it was necessarily the same with Thatcher. I believe a lot of people. I don't know. The UK in general has a slight not the UK in general. I guess England specifically has a little bit of a conservative streak. Not really.
Twain, leaving a big grassy gap in the middle. That's because it was designed as a couple of slip roads, and the rest of Ringway 3 was meant to go this way.
Today, the M25 has earned itself an infamous reputation in popular culture.
The M25.
Yeah,
It is the most
I haven't seen a single person who likes her. That's so interesting. Because like that whole generation of politicians, like a good amount of the world seems to realize that they were freaking terrible. But in the United States, Ronald Reagan is like Republican Jesus. He was like the guy before Trump. He was the guy. Like nobody ever like reached that cult-like status until Donald Trump. Now Trump is seen as like the new, like Trump is seen as kind of a turning point from the Reagan era. But up until recently, Reagan has been held on to just desperately. I'm asking about Margaret Thatcher, if she's still popular in England. Because I think a lot of conservative Americans still think she's popular in England, but I don't know if actual English people still consider her popular. Clearly he's poking fun at her, but I'm just moving back a little bit.
And the rest of Ringway 3 was meant to go this way.
Today, the M25 has earned itself an infamous reputation in popular culture.
The M25.
It is the most congested motorway in the UK and is increasingly inadequate for the needs of London and the South East.
For example, people travelling from Brighton to Reading use this section of the N25. And people travelling from Croydon, trying to get their flight at Heathrow, use the same section of the N25. Busy, busy, busy.
All on its own, the M25 does a job that was meant to be taken on by 3 motorways. There's no alternative further out, and there's no real alternative further in.
The closest thing London has to a suburban ring road is made up of...
Yes and no. That's about the answer I expected.
They're not much good either.
The North Circular whizzes...
North Circular and the South Circular. But they're not much good either.
The North Circular whizzes through the suburbs like a twat going, "Yeah, look at me, out of my way, I'm the North Circular, hey!" But it comes to an abrupt stop at the Woolwich Ferry.
And then, once south of the river, it has a complete change of character, going...
Oh, sorry, excuse me, do you mind if I... Oh, terribly sorry. Excuse me, could I just get... Oh, sorry.
So how did we end up with only half of Ringway 2? In other words, why is North London better than South London?
Oh, jeez.
It predates ringways by several decades. The North Circular Road came about in the 30s when much of North London was still being developed, so there was loads of room to make it wide, fast and more or less future-proof. When the ringway scheme came along in 1966, all it needed was a bit of widening here and there. Half the job done. The South Circular, on the other hand, was a different story altogether. The route it takes goes on streets that have been here for centuries. In fact, there isn't really such thing as the South Circular Road at all. It's just a series of scarcely believable road signs.
It was then, and still is now, totally inadequate as a ring road. But widening it was out of the question. To finish Ringway 2, they needed to build a completely new South Circular that was as much of a twat as the North. But to build a 20th century road through 19th century suburbs, it was a case of ploughing through whatever buildings were unlucky enough to be in the way. This nice street was on their hit list.
You just stuck a sparkler into a fake... that's actually fun. That must... I was like, oh, is he doing that? Is this like an After Effect thing? But no, like, he just took a sparkler and stuck it into a bomb-shaped thing.
But to build a
That's a fun practical effect.
19th century suburbs, it was a case of ploughing through whatever buildings were unlucky enough to be in the way. This nice street was on their hit list.
The best way to see the destruction...
I might steal that and try it on a child to see what happens.
the new road would have caused is to look from above. A total of 36,000 people in suburbs like Beckenham and Crystal Palace would have their homes exploded to make way for the new road. One look at this terrifying artist's impression and the planners decided it just wasn't worth it.
So Ringway 2 was cancelled and Outer London was spared. But in central London, traffic was at such a standstill that something had to be done. So in 1967, a small section of motorway was given the go-ahead.
London's Westway twists and turns from White City to Marylebone.
So this, like the previous one, has like the human problem. That there are people who live there. That, like, we can all probably plan a really, I don't know if we could all do it. I probably couldn't, but maybe you could. A lot of us could plan like a perfect place if nobody would say no or have a problem with anything you say about that place. However, there comes the problem where this is Earth and there are people who live here, and therefore that's a problem. Like sometimes when people talk about like their fantasy government or whatever, because like, you know, social studies majors, political science majors, whatever, we chat about like what would we change or what our ideals would look like, but they always kind of run into like the people problem, and that you're not going to get everybody to go along with what you want. Even if it's practical, you have to consider the human element.
The go-ahead.
London's Westway twists and turns from White City to Marylebone.
Ooh, we got an answer about how Sri Lankan people feel about Margaret Thatcher. Right. According to my parents, most people here like her mostly because she partially saved the country economically back when Sri Lanka's economic, sorry, I'm having trouble reading. Economic was self-combusting. Okay. I could see that being it. She's got, I'd imagine it's got to be different depending on where you're from, because like she's got like an imperialist streak, but she was also seen as like relatively tough, so I could see how she could develop some fans. But I just wasn't sure how like they would feel today. But like, yeah, for like that specific case, yeah, I'm sure it's there are different reasons or whatever for people who actually live in England.
Although technically not part of
that's
it,
interesting.
It gives us a perfect view of what Ringway 1, the motorway box, would have looked like, and how it would have affected the surrounding area.
It was the construction of the Westway that woke London up to the reality of what a city throttled by a motorway box would be like. Just like here in Notting Hill, many more parts of inner London would have a motorway like this blasted through the middle.
Including Kilburn,
Kilburn,
Camden, Canonbury, Brixton and Battersea.
The locals were understandably not happy, and they protested.
Londoners took to the streets to oppose what they saw as the destruction of their city. And if that wasn't enough of a headache for the Greater London Council, the Treasury weren't happy about how much the Ringway scheme was going to cost.
There were some heated discussions at the time between the GLC and the Treasury as to who would finance.
Oh! Greater London Council 1969 to 76? Cool!
Some heated discussions at the time between the GLC and the Treasury as to who would finance the London Ringway scheme. Ringway 1 was causing the most controversy as it was the most expensive per mile.
Really?
We estimate it cost £2 billion. That's £18 billion in today's money.
That's very interesting.
But there was no public support, negative press, so the government decided it could not finance the London Ringway scheme.
A combination of protest, financial woes and political kerfuffle brought an end to Ringways 4, 3, 2 and 1. So what legacy remains of Ringways today?
Looking on a map, there are flecks of Ringway 4, which in some parts of Hertfordshire is confusingly called the North Orbital Road. The short and stubby West Cross route in Shepherd's Bush was planned as part of Ringway 1, and so was the East Cross route. Until the year 2000, these were both shown in blue as proper motorways on the map.
Also, when Ringways was cancelled, it had a knock-on effect, and lots of other road building projects were cancelled too, including some that they'd already started.
The M23 from Brighton stops at this mysterious unfinished junction just after the M25, instead of Ringway 2, where they wanted it to finish. Here's another example, the M1, which stops at Staples Corner. You can see on Google Earth they left plenty of room at this junction for it to carry on further south, but without Ringway 1, there was nowhere for it to end. If built to plan, the M1 would have met Ringway 1 at West Hampstead at an enormous triple-layer junction, totally ruining
this landscape. Really? Surely no one cares about this place. It's tempting when you're in a traffic jam like this one to think about how useful those ringways would have been. But it's a complicated issue. There are pros and cons. Pro, The motorways would have taken traffic away from the surface streets. This road would be much nicer, quieter and safer if it weren't lumbered with the unenviable task of being the South Circular. Con: 60% of Londoners would have lived 2 miles away from a motorway. They would have been so ugly, so prominent and so everywhere that London would have become famous for them. Pro: with ringways, East London would have got itself a new bridge at Woolwich. Much more convenient than this boat.
Motorways would be physical boundaries, dividing up communities. Londoners would probably identify themselves by which ring roads they were stuck between.
Pro: they'd make journeys faster. Con: actually they wouldn't.
Actually, they wouldn't.
That building new roads attracts more cars. Los Angeles is mostly highways, and the traffic jams there are worse than here. Had ringways happened in London, it would have set the precedent that you're supposed to drive. The jams would continue, ringways would defeat their own...
Yeah, like in the United States, our infrastructure is designed just for cars, and we have a traffic problem. So, like, it'd probably be better to build roads around alternatives that would, like, decongest things. We talked about trains before. We could probably use better train infrastructure here. I'd imagine that would probably help a lot more if people didn't have to own a car.
own purpose.
You have to admire the optimism and confidence they had back then. In the 60s, the word progress was a much simpler word.
More cars, taller buildings, wider roads, rebuild everything, more! Everything we do is amazing!
But today's approach is a softer, more cautious one. It's not that we're scared of progress. We're simply scared of cars.
Transport policy today is almost entirely about measures to reduce the number of drivers. The fact that London is such a crazy, improbable maze is possibly the best way to encourage people not to bother with the car and use public transport instead.
The lack of motorways has allowed areas like Camden to come to life. I think future generations trying to solve the transport problems of their time will be grateful for what the 20th century did.
Gilgamesh. Where is that? Gilgamesh Restaurant Lounge. Oh, that's weird.
Problems of their time will be grateful for what
That's a weird
the 20th
gimmick.
century didn't do. So it looks like for the foreseeable future, we'll have to sit in traffic jams no matter what. And if that's true, we might as well sit in our traffic jams and enjoy the view.
Oh, okay. So this is really fun to learn about. Like it's one of those things where in theory it would be nice if we could like fix a lot of these problems, but we've kind of dug our grave in a lot of them. I don't want to be defeatist. I really don't, because like you want to believe that you can make things better, but there are always going to be layers of complexity that I'm just glad I don't have to make these decisions. That's all. Like everybody has a theory or whatever. I'm glad I don't have to share mine, because I probably wouldn't know what I'm doing. But this is absolutely fascinating. There's a video from CGP Grey where he talked, I think it's his most popular video, where he talks about like ways of like fixing traffic, which I think we might benefit from checking out at some point, because I find him to be smart and insightful. I'm curious to his approach to that. So we'll probably get around to that at some point in the future. I don't think today. It's not in today's playlist, and I have a lot to get to. And we still have one more of these to do. So, want to talk about planes? Planes sound like fun. Planes. Here we go. Planes.
London has more airports than any other city in the world. 6. Why? Most big cities have one huge airport. How did London end up with so many little ones? And why are they in such inconvenient places? The answer is a fiddly and complicated one. Come with me now through the mists of time.
Make this a little louder.
To a time 10 minutes before Britain's aviation story started. When our story starts.
In 1903, the Wright brothers invented the aeroplane. 5 years later, an engineer with an enormous moustache called Claude Graham White set up Britain's first aerodrome in Hendon in North London. All you needed for an aerodrome was a large field with enough room for taking off and landing, somewhere to store the planes when you weren't flying them, and a clubhouse that wouldn't let you in unless you had a bushy enough moustache.
So far, flying was just a leisure pursuit for the fabulously wealthy who already had their own planes.
I say, chaps, last one to arrive in Manchester has to telephone the Queen to blow a raspberry.
But little did Claude Graham White know that his expensive hobby things were soon to become of major military importance. In the First World War, aeroplanes were used for taking photos of and then dropping bombs on the enemy. The newly formed Royal Flying Corps took over Hendon and started building new aerodromes all over the southeast.
Britain was in a grip of plane mania, or plania if you will.
Plania.
It was clear after the war that planes were going to play a huge role in the country's future. But predicting and...
CGP said, frick the pedestrians, basically. Well, I'm curious, I'll hear his words, and if we have any critiques of his approach, then we'll try to talk about him. Though I often am hesitant to critique people who I feel are smarter than me. I can at least bring up a couple of my concerns. We'll see what it ends up being. I'm not going to avoid it just because like some people think it's bad. Like we'll see what happens.
Sensibly preparing for this future was harder than you might think.
Some experts thought the plane would go the same way as the car, smaller and more affordable, and that everyone would be flying their own private planes around, just like Biggles. Biggles. These serious plans from the 1920s
get the banana.
and 30s showed just how wrong it was possible to be.
This is my favourite one. In 1931, there was a genuine plan to build an aerodrome right here in the middle of London, on the rooftop of King's Cross Station.
It would have had 6 runways facing in all directions, with planes taxiing round the outside like an enormous bicycle wheel. The idea was people could commute to central London by plane.
It seems ludicrous now, but 30 years prior to that, the idea of flying at all was pretty insane. So this wasn't much of a stretch. What actually happened was planes were getting bigger and could travel much longer distances. Civil aviation was about to take off.
In 1920, Wadden Aerodrome transformed itself into Croydon Airport, London's first terminal for passengers.
Suddenly, you didn't need your own plane to fly. All you needed was loads of money. Croydon Airport had a terminal building, a solid tarmac runway, a control tower, and a hotel.
It was the jewel of South London.
Yeah, I have a book on the history of aviation. Like it's like the early history that I never really got into. It is a very elite approach to history, especially early on. So, and that's usually not how I like to approach history, at least not anymore. There was a time where I was fascinated by like great men or whatever, but I've kind of moved further and further away from that the more I study history. So, like but there is something incredibly interesting about like great inventors and that sort of stuff, and like how this new technology is brought in and later further democratized, I guess. It's more available now than it's ever been, so I suppose things move from being elite to like more broadly available, so whatever.
Gateway to the Empire. Claude Graham White got jealous and wanted to cash in, and he transformed Hendon into a proper airport too. Then, all the other aerodromes joined in the fun, such as Heston, Northolt, and Biggin Hill.
London had an exciting new industry, but things were about to speed up and get serious all over again for World War Round 2.
The Royal Flying Corps, which by now had the much catchier name Royal Air Force, needed to build even more air bases to defend Britain from the Nazis. Once again, it was war that sped up progress and changed the map of Britain forever.
Dude, you gotta stop. You gotta stop. Going right over here. Let's try that. There we go. Sometimes I just have to move something in the room and see if it distracts the bird. Sometimes he just needs to be distracted.
Thanks to the
Back.
war, even more people would now be able to fly, as planes were bigger, faster, and cheaper. They'd stopped sounding like this, and started sounding like this. And that was a problem.
Croydon's runways were too short and too close to people's houses for the new noisy planes. So Croydon Airport was forced to close in 1959.
It was the same
So
problem
it
for
was
all of them.
completely antiquated at that point.
1947.
Northolt in 1954, Biggin Hill in 1994. Really? 1994? And good old Hendon in 1957.
So what's happened to all those airports that disappeared?
Northolt and
They must, I'd assume this is because they're just not preparing for the scale of what airports are now, and they don't have room to accommodate what people do now. I'd assume that's like the direction that he's going here. And therefore they were just antiquated and put out of business by people who were far more capable of meeting the needs of people.
Biggin Hill have been promoted back to mere RAF bases. You always know you're nearby Northolt when the street lamps are ducking out of the way of planes. Croydon Airport has now become a park, housing and industrial estate. And in case anyone forgets, this plane has been kept here ever since. Heston has been turned into Heston Service Station on the M4 and a golf course called Airlinks. And there's one tiny hangar still there. Aww. And finally, Claude Graham
That's so
Hendon
sad.
has turned into a really dodgy housing estate, appropriately named Graham Park.
The street names here acknowledge the area's aviation heritage, such as Aviation Drive and Heritage Avenue. Most appropriately of all, Graham Park includes the RAF Museum, who wouldn't let us in for filming. The new generation of airports would have to be much bigger and much further away from built-up areas. So, in 1945, the government converted an airbase to the west of London that they thought was far away enough. We know it today as the airport that rules the roost. You know the one I mean? It's this one, the one we all know. This is what it is. I'm going to say it now. Here it comes. Yes, it's the one you think it is.
It's not.
You've guessed it, the Jewel of West London. Here it comes. This is what it is. It's this, everyone's favourite airport. You know the one. It's what you've all been waiting for. Here it comes now.
A small West London hamlet called Heathrow, 2 words, was the site of the Great West Aerodrome, which was turned into the new London Airport, later Heathrow Airport. In those days, the terminals were very basic, especially this one. But it stood the test of time, and today, Heathrow is still London's #1 airport.
Okay, I thought he was like going to do a thing where it ends up actually being a very obscure airport.
In a rare act of
I was confused about the bit.
the government knew they would need a backup airport to support Heathrow. So in 1958, RAF Gatwick became Gatwick Airport, a smaller version of Heathrow with just 1 runway. It was
Do you think you'll react to Montemayor's Midway series at some point in the future? I'm not aware of what that is, but you know, maybe. I haven't taken it off the table because I didn't know it was an option, but you know, maybe. Now I've heard about it, so I'm far more likely to check it out at some point.
London's #2 airport, a title it still holds to this day.
Unfortunately, the government didn't plan forward quite far enough. The 1960s brought about a huge change that they couldn't possibly have seen coming.
The 1960s package holiday boom was the first time flying became really popular. Brits of all classes were jetting off to all sorts of exciting destinations, mostly in Spain. Women with unconvincing fixed smiles used to catch beach balls while old men adjusted their glasses.
Soon, Heathrow and Gatwick
That is what the world looked like at one
The
point.
race was now on to build London's 3rd airport. But where to put it? By now, planes had become so noisy that choosing the location for a new airport had become extremely complicated and controversial. Not just any place possessed the appropriate properties to be propelled into a proper popular passenger port for people. London's 3rd airport would need to meet strict criteria.
It needed to have room for expansion. It needed to have good transport links. It needed to be near to where people live, but not too near to where people live. The man
It's a
commissioned to
delicate
find this
balance.
possibly perfect place was the hilariously named Justice Baron Eustace Wentworth Roskill, and he didn't have a clue what he was doing.
As if asking for trouble, Roskill suggested sites with such fairy tale names as Thurley, Cublington and Nuthampstead for the third airport. Naturally, the no-nonsense, no-noise, NIMBY, naysaying neighbours said no. So Roskill then
I love alliteration.
On the Thames... on the Thames estuary. The government said, that's a stupid...
Why is nobody staring at the guy with the hat and camera crew? That's what I'm always looking at when people film in public. I'm just seeing like if the people in the background are just like staring right into the lens.
idea. Building an expensive airport in the middle of the Thames estuary in the middle of a recession? Ha! Ludicrous.
But Roskill would not be deterred.
I will not be deterred.
In 1977, he noticed that the solution was right under his nose all along. The southeast was still littered with RAF bases from both wars. Why not simply do the same as they'd always done and convert another airbase into London's third airport?
Why didn't he just come up with that simple idea in the first place?
The airbase he chose to convert was RAF Stansted in Essex. London finally got its third airport. But its title, London's Third Airport, is misleading. When Stansted was chosen, RAF Luton had already been turned into a proper airport back in 1938, but it didn't count as London's third airport because it was meant to serve the home counties of Beds, Herts and Bucks, and not London. Confusingly, Stansted was further away from London than Luton was, and even more confusingly, Luton changed its name in 1990 to London Luton Airport 1 year before Stansted finally got its very long overdue grand opening in 1991, which technically means that London's fourth airport came first and London's third airport came second.
That is
Luton's
weird.
rebranding trick
That's
has been tried
hard
by
to
lots of
follow.
other airports, including
London Oxford, which is 61 miles away from London. Nice try. There's a London Manston, London Cambridge. The worst offender has to be London Ashford, which is closer to France than London, and some 20 miles from Ashford.
the only other airport apart from Luton that's managed this rebranding trick successfully is Southend in 2012.
With a bit of spit and polish and a new train station, London's Southend Airport has found its way onto the official list, which brings our total to 5.
The sixth and final one on the list, London City Airport, is the odd one out.
Because instead of being built on a former RAF base like all the others, it was built from scratch in 1987 at the same time as Canary Wharf, on an old dock that by happy coincidence was runway-shaped already. To this day, it's only used by wankers.
So that, in a nutshell, brings us to the present day with all 6 of London's airports. But what's happened to them since? How are they used today? And what's going to happen to them in the future?
That is a great question.
Subscribe for part 2.
Oh, there's a... Oh, dude, there's more? Oh, dude, I only plan to do 3 of these. Sorry, I have to give the bird a seed or he's gonna beat me up or something. Where's the seed? Feel weird leaving it there. I feel really weird leaving it there. But I have so much more to do today. So I guess next time, in the next stream, we're going to be doing more of this and we're gonna get some actual answers on London's airports. That should be a lot of fun. I'm actually really enjoying this series. I find it a little bit harder to do commentary on this series than the Mapmen stuff, not knowing as much like information in general about London. I feel like I'm a little bit out of my depth and I'm learning a lot of it from scratch, so not having that very strong foundation is oh dude, am I doing 4? It feels like kind of a jerk move to leave without it and just it wasn't part of the plan. But if something gets a cut, if we do one less Geography Now video, it's your fault. Okay? Hold on. Now I have to go find it because I clicked off the video and now, yeah, obviously. So yes, we'll do the last one. Why not? If you scream one more time, I'm going to eat you. I think we're good. I think we're actually good. No! Ah!
Edgware in northwest London
Hold on,
used to
hold
look
on.
like that.
I'm I'm getting to the video. We're gonna get... Okay. Why Heathrow needs to expand is what it's called. Has the bird ever pooped in my hat? Always. All the time. Every day. That is like most of my life. Okay, I've pulled up the video. I'm not gonna wait for the bird to stop screaming. We are just gonna jump right into it. You're gonna just have to try to hear it regardless.
Previously on Unfinished London.
Why does Heathrow need to expand? There we go. Boom.
London has 6 airports: Heathrow, Gatwick, Stansted, Luton, Southend City. But the biggest and most important by far is Heathrow. Here it is in 1945. It used to have 6 runways arranged in this shape.
And here it is in 2014. 2 of the runways have been embiggened so that today's massive planes can use them. The terminal has been completely rebuilt and new ones added here, here, here and here. The 4 old runways haven't been used for decades because they're too short now, but they can still clearly be seen. From above, you can see just how huge Heathrow has now become.
Today, Heathrow has become the busiest international airport on the planet. More than a third of the 70 million passengers who use Heathrow every year are not even visiting London. They're changing planes on all sorts of improbable journeys, from Hong Kong to Honduras, Moscow to Miami, and Aberdeen to Abu Dhabi.
Why should we care about all the people who use our airport without even popping in to say hello?
Okay, I was confused there. Like, this looks like it's off scale. Nobody's luggage is that big, or it shouldn't be.
Well,
they bring in cash.
But no, he's screened in.
They bring in cash for British
I'm
Airlines.
gullible.
Passengers with a long wait for their connecting flight will spend a night in London, contributing to the local economy. And it makes London the best place to do business. But not for long.
Heathrow, with its 2 runways, is starting to fall massively behind its rival hub airports in Europe.
Such as Paris Charles de Gaulle, which operates 24 hours a day, Madrid Barajas, which has 4 huge runways, and Amsterdam's Schiphol with a staggering 6 runways and still room to expand further if it wants to. Everywhere you go,
I'm back. I could hear what was going on. Don't worry.
Airports are supposed to look like in 2014, and Heathrow is starting to look helplessly small.
Poor Heathrow can't expand because its location, in what's now become the middle of the suburbs, means it's hemmed in by thousands of disgruntled neighbours.
So what's it like living next door to the world's busiest airport?
Well, as you can imagine, it's impossible.
There we go.
Human sacrifices.
To placate the residents of Hounslow...
Like, I could only imagine. Like, I live in a very small place, so I guess wherever you live, you're not that far from the airport. And even with that, you'll catch me being like, oh, there's an airplane going over the head. It's loud and disrupting. Like some people I know. And like, I can maintain a healthy distance from it and still experience that a decent amount. So like, I could only imagine being that close.
Richmond and Windsor, the British... Shut up! British Aviation Authority has a number of restrictions on the airport. No flights are allowed between 11 p.m. and 5 a.m.
Yeah, she was very thrilled.
But during the day, planes can take off every 46 seconds. If the slightest delay occurs, the knock-on effects can go on for hours. And landing's really tricky too. In such a crowded airport, planes often have to go round and round in circles, waiting for the runway to be free.
Isn't that just typically British? Just like with our trains and our sport, we got there first and now we're the worst. In 2001, a plan was put forward to get Heathrow back in competition. And it was one of the most controversial British plans in British planning history plans.
They suggested building a 3rd runway north of the current 2. All they had to do to make room for it was destroy an entire village. Very unsurprisingly, the local residents were furious and terrified. A massive Don't Expand Heathrow campaign was started, backed by Greenpeace, the Conservative Party, and...
We talked about this. It's the people problem. You could plan anything if people didn't exist and you didn't have to accommodate for them. I believe we've had similar protests to similar projects around here.
celebrity impressionist Alistair McGowan. So the designers apologised and came up with a better plan, extending the current runways to the west, where the only things in the way are the M25 and a reservoir.
Again, why didn't they just think of that in the first place?
But the protesters still weren't happy. The point was, an expanded Heathrow would become the biggest producer of CO2 in the country. A pretty irresponsible move given how serious we now know the issue of climate change to be. Expanding Heathrow would be a disaster.
But if Heathrow stayed at its current size, it would lose its hub status within a decade. If Heathrow falls behind, London falls behind. And if London falls behind, the UK falls behind. And that simply couldn't be allowed to happen. Ow.
A massive Do Expand Heathrow campaign was started, backed by airlines, trade unions, and celebrity business beard Richard Branson. Not
Of course it's
expanding
Richard.
Heathrow would be a disaster.
It seems that no matter what the government decides
Yeah.
to do, they'll be pissing off a lot of people. How on earth do you reconcile the demands of the locals, the economy, the airlines, and the environment? One man who thinks he has the solution to everything is Tory Mayor of London, Boris Johnson.
Oh no! Boris Johnson, actually, I wish I knew more about him. It's like for the peak of a lot of his events, it was the Trump administration here. So a lot of the things that he did that came off as kind of like over the top and absurd and newsworthy were kind of overshadowed in the States by our similarly but probably more eccentric president. So yeah, it was so I missed out on a lot of Boris Johnson highlights
I propose that we
for a while.
in the thing. But what the plan for the thing? What's the whole the whole thing will be built. And by the house will fall. Huh?
Boris Island, like many other things named after him, wasn't actually his idea. But I have
You
to
got stuff
say,
named
it's a
after him?
really catchy name. It's basically the same idea as the one suggested in the 1970s by Captain Stupid Name. And building an airport on reclaimed land in the middle of the sea has been done loads of times before. The Japanese do it all the time.
Kansai, Narita, Chubu, Nagasaki.
The advantages of Boris Island can be most clearly seen from Google Earth. The site is huge. There's space for 4 runways, plus plenty of room in the sea for a few more. Planes can take off and land 24 hours a day because it's over water rather than land, so there's no one nearby to complain about the noise. At least no one who matters. But the scheme has plenty of disadvantages too. Boris Island raises more questions than it answers, such as,
How are people going to get from London to the new airport? More trains onto the already crowded High-Speed 1? A new motorway? There's not much room for either of those.
what about the environment? The Thames Estuary Airport is no better for...
Is he, like, clubbing a
than an
seal?
expanded Heathrow. In fact, it's a lot worse. How long
I assume
than an expanded Heathrow?
I assume that's what he's. If I'm wrong, I assume this is like seal clubbing. I don't know if that's anything that they would have in the UK. I'm trying to think somewhere within the UK where they would even have that. But that's the thing in northern North America. I think in New Brunswick they might still like heavily subsidize that industry, which I believe I heard, I don't remember who from, that it's not even like that profitable an industry anymore, and there's not really that much. Seal clubbing is not a popular industry anymore, but they subsidize it because of like tradition or whatever. It's weird. Seal clubbing is not actually the industry. I am joking with that part, but you can follow.
In fact, it's a lot worse. How long is it going to take? If Boris Island does go ahead, it won't be...
Oh, you do have seals, but generally chill in the sea. They don't get on land very often. Oh, okay. They're protected as well.
30 years, and I don't plan to live that long. And finally, the biggest question of them all, who's going to pay for it? Sources estimate that the entire scheme will cost more than £100,000. While the politicians
pretty
bicker
heavy.
about whether or not Boris Island will ever actually be built, there's something I'm particularly fascinated by that no one seems to have mentioned. If Boris Island replaces Heathrow and Heathrow gets closed, What are they going to put in its place? We've already seen what happened to London's first generation of airports that closed in the 50s, but Heathrow's different from all of these because it's huge. It's 3,000 acres of totally flat land served by the Piccadilly line and Crossrail and the M4 and the M25 and millions of people already living nearby. So,
what do you do with it?
With Heathrow?
Farming, mostly. West London needs a green lung.
A massive lawn with an angry guy telling you to get off my land!
Big enough for your mum.
Solve our prison overcrowding problem by building an offenders village.
An airport.
An offenders village.
Game of Thrones.
What a British idea. Just build a place to send all the offenders. He's not saying a prison, right? That's not like some weird Londonism where you're like, it's not a prison, it's an offenders village. I think it sounds more in line with like Australia as a prison and colony, but maybe I'm misinterpreting that.
Land, dum 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 dum.
This is all nonsense. It'll basically be another Canary Wharf. I'm a geography teacher.
Nando's, hashtag Nando's, hashtag I love Nando's.
That's the other guy from Mad Men.
Disappointingly, it turns out that if they build Boris Island, Heathrow is...
I'm a geography teacher.
So, if Boris Island's too radical and expanding Heathrow's too unpopular, then what else could we do to solve the capacity problem?
Stansted and Luton have both offered themselves up for embiggening, arrogantly thinking they can replace Heathrow. Gatwick wants to build a second runway, and there's even talk of connecting up Gatwick to Heathrow with a new railway, in the naive assumption that travellers will be willing to use both airports as a super inconvenient...
More like a penal colony.
There is a fourth option, doing nothing. After all, is London justified in wishing to remain an international hub? If you actually look at the economic argument, it's all built on potential future business. Suspiciously, everybody who says that London needs an international hub stands to make quite a lot of money from it. Is it just possible that Heathrow's future as a decent-sized airport really wouldn't be so bad? In any case, it's not up to me. Going on right now as we speak is a commission to answer the question once and for all. Sir Howard Davis, the modern...
So this has been kind of dated, so this would have been settled at this point.
The day equivalent of Roskill has until the general election in 2015 to come up with the answer. Whatever he decides, we won't know if he's made the right decision until about 2053, when it'll be really obvious what he should have done.
The future has always been about flying. A simulation of the future doesn't look right unless it's got things whizzing through the air. But what does the future really hold for air travel? Will there be bigger planes? Vertical takeoff? Space travel? The end of civilization?
It's so unpleasant to be there. I'm sorry.
We have no option but to guess. We've been getting it slightly wrong for the last 100 years, and it looks like we'll continue getting it wrong for many years to come.
Jeez. So that's the actual end of our unfinished London segment of the day. Like we added an extra one because you were all very insistent that we do so, and I'm generally a people pleaser. That's why I'm so popular. So I'm just going to find my playlist. Where did I put that? I guess I whatever. That was really interesting. So there's like 20 something episodes of these unfinished London things. I would like to, I don't know if I'm gonna do them in bulk like I just did again, but I might just add one to each stream. Like it just becomes part of the weekly tradition. We take on one unfinished London, we take on at least one geography now. I think that might be the direction that I go with it going forward. I mean, if it makes things easier.